Hello, good afternoon. My name is Marcy Fleming. I'm from the University of Oklahoma. And with me today is Lynette Chowden from Gideon Taylor. And we'd like to tell you about this big, huge project we've done at the University of Oklahoma. So we have consolidated two PeopleSoft systems into one. We did it in about 11 months. And this is now where we are at. We're at PeopleSoft 9.2 with PeopleTools 8, 5, 7, 11. And our GT eForms framework is 3.30. And we're in the middle of updating all of those things again. So it's pretty busy right now. We consolidated our traditional state research university with our health sciences center university system. So both campuses had very different processes and we tried very hard to bring them together. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. We'll go over our history at OU with PeopleSoft, the efforts we've done for bringing them together. We're going to look at a couple of the forms, which is always really cool to see how other people have deployed the technology. And then we'll talk a little bit about what else we're doing and what's coming at OU. So our university has two main campuses. We end up with about 20,000 or so employees that span the whole gamut of kinds of employees, from temporary sorts like student employees and actual temps to physicians and faculty and researchers that are doing work for NASA. So it's a pretty wide range. We have three campuses. Norman is our traditional research university. Oklahoma City is our health sciences center, and Tulsa is a blending of programs from both of the other two campuses. And now we went from two PeopleSoft systems, one aligned with each of the large campuses, into one. You want to go to the next slide? So like everybody, we started with paper forms. And even pre-PeopleSoft, very much paper. We've had PeopleSoft in place on both campuses for over 20 years, and we put in ePath separately into the two PeopleSoft systems in the last, I want to say, 15 years or so. And that was very helpful to put in ePath and the eForms. We created a known approval path. It got rid of a lot of the paper and the redundant data entry. The kind of current state that left us in was that IT or the developers at GT were the ones that make updates. Now, with our consolidation that we completed in 2020 and we're now living with for the first year in 2021, we aimed at using the PeopleSoft technology that's delivered instead of quite the spaghetti monster of customizations. We going into one system has allowed us to cross-train our teams. And now with the newest framework from Gideon Taylor, HR is involved in the updates and building out of the forms because it's very configuration driven. And that's something that my functional super users can be involved in. So what we ended up delivering in our consolidation project is a whole bunch of forms here. And several of them were rebuilds of the ones we had before. And then some of them were new, like we took a paper form and we're like, we're not living with this paper form anymore and we're going to integrate it. One of those that we're going to see in a couple minutes is the pre-authorization form there towards the bottom of the list. And that form is used when departments are requesting a personnel action. They're asking permission to do the thing in advance of actually putting the action into PeopleSoft. So we have kind of a pre-approval before they're allowed to hire a person or give a raise or anything. And that used to live on paper. And now it lives in PeopleSoft and integrates with all the employee data, which is fantastic. It reduced a lot of double entry. in this consolidation, we were able to do a lot of conditional programming based on who the employee was, including like how you even get to the forms. So there on the side is what my record would look like. And because I'm a staff employee, I have certain choices, related actions that appear there. If I were faculty, that would look different. Or if I was a student employee, that list would look different. In the past, the users had to know what form to grab, as opposed to what they were actually trying to do to me as the employee. We also got really in depth with using the forms to help us keep position and job data synchronized. So we put in position management, and one of our campuses has used position management for years, but it would easily get out of sync with job data because EPAF wasn't programmed, the old EPAF wasn't programmed to update both. And so it'd update job data, and then that was out of sync with the position data. And then on our Health Sciences Center campus, we didn't even use position management. So we put position management in place in processes for both campuses, and then use the forms to keep that in sync. So we developed, this is the pre-authorization form. We had in mind that we had several cycles of approval. So each box here represents a workflow of approval, and a lot of times redundant data entry from box to box. So we started with a form that we called the freeze form, and it was like the exemption to our hiring freeze. And hiring freeze was always a term that was, sometimes it was just a cold period, but not totally frozen. So this form let people kind of ask for an exemption, ask for permission ahead of time. The form was paper, it would get lost, it would sit on people's desks for a long time. No one really knew where it was. Every college or division routed it differently, and there was no real oversight of who was giving approvals. If someone asked me centrally, like who approved the freeze form for that thing, I'd have to go find the freeze form, look at it, and wonder whose signatures those were. So it was very much a typical paper process. And it was the first round of approval for a personnel action. So if you wanted to do a raise for somebody, you'd have to first go through this freeze form, and it would go see all these people and get approved. And then, or let's say in this case, it's a job listing. So you get a request for a job. You want to put a request to fill a job. And then the next step is we had a separate form that kind of verified and allowed you to update the job description that's outside of our recruiting system. So it was attached to the position number. And this allowed the opportunity to classify the job correctly, to do a job analysis to make sure the job they're asking for is the job that the title that it really is. Not both campuses did not use it. And this form, while it was electronic, it went through a bunch of approval routing as well, and a bunch of duplicate data entry. Then once it was approved there, it would feed into our recruiting system, which is Taleo, and a job listing there gets a bunch of additional approvals, another whole workflow. And then when you select your candidate and you're going to hire them, you go to the hire EPAF and you enter all of that information again, and it goes through another set of workflow. So this was the state we had been living in for probably 10 years. So then in this project, we took the opportunity to clean that up some. So we still have some repeated workflow cycles, but that's been by request. So if the institution could stomach not seeing the same data over and over again, we can now reduce that if they wanted to. So the pre-authorization step 1, this process is designed to say, put in all the information you want for the request, use PeopleSoft data instead of having to look at PeopleSoft and type it back into a paper form, a PDF. The PeopleSoft data initializes into the form, and then it routes for approval. and the information that's pertinent to a job listing, it gets integrated into Talleo's job listings. Now, the job listing still gets approved and goes through a workflow, but the data gets there in a more integrated way. Then once you've chosen your candidate and you're ready to hire them, you start a step 2 form that pulls in all the data that was improved on the step 1 form. So if they decided they're going to hire patient care representative 1 at, $20 an hour, when they go to actually put a person in it, the form is programmed smart enough to not let them change the job title on the hire, because they have to hire what was approved, and they can't exceed the salary that was approved on the step 1 form. So it kind of does that policing for us that we were having to do manually before. And then when it executes, it updates both position and job data and keeps it in sync. It's a much more streamlined process than it used to be. People can use the features of the eForms, like seeing the routing, knowing whose desk it's sitting on. They can do all of that with this pre-authorization process, and they couldn't before. So this was a huge win for our users. And we got lots of good feedback about it. So Lynette's going to walk us through a demo of that form.
Thanks, Mercy. I get to do the fun part, to show all the exciting things that are in PeopleSoft. Of course, Mercy, if you have anything you want to add as we go through, just let me know. So we're going to step through the pre-authorization form that Marcy described. You're going to see that whole process that unfolds in that very linear way within the forms, and see how quickly the users can go ahead and submit things. So the first thing is they have a tile that they can click on. It's the ePath search page. They get some instructions on the page right when they click there, so they know how to proceed or what needs to be done. In order to start that new freeze process, there's really 2 ways that they can get into the form and start it. And there are also some avenues where they don't need that pre-authorization. And so over here, you can see there's links like hire new staff or hire new non-staff, because they also have that branching where non-staff, you can just hire people and there isn't the whole pre-authorization that goes with it. So the first way we'll show is using this Omni search at the top, where they can enter information. We searched by name, Harry Potter. It gives us the list of all of the Harry Potters in the system. We can see some of them just have personal data. If some of them had a job and been terminated, here you can see that they're termed, or you could see their position details, so you can make sure you're picking the right Harry Potter. And then you get a list of actions based on your security as a user coming into this form, what you're able to do. And so if you don't have row level permissions for that person, maybe you can't update their job, but you could transfer them or something like that. So here we're going to say this first Harry Potter is the right one, and we want to do a pay FTE increase. So this is where for OU's process, they actually need to come in, and before they do a job change form to put that into PeopleSoft, they first have to ask and get permission to say, from a budget perspective, can I offer this to this employee type of thing? And then once it gets approved, then it flows through into the second form that actually updates job data. So here we can see, because we opened the form for Harry Potter, we can see Harry Potter's name up at the top, and it's populated with the information, like the type of request, because we picked it from the menu, the position number they're in, and job details throughout the form. But probably the more common way that we'll see people come in is they'll just go in and say, hey, I need a pre-authorization. They know that they want to post a job on Taleo for people to apply. And so this is that first step of saying, I would like to post a job. So they come in here and say, I want to fill a position because of a promotion or a transfer. I want to create 2 new positions. And then they can give us all of the attributes of that position. You saw they selected the job code on this form. That's going to be important for the second page because we will inherit some attributes based on that job code that was entered. They can indicate things like, will there be a drug test required? Is there a driver's license check? What they want for their introduction on the job posting. The second page here, they have another form that manages at a job code level. They're using the non-person profile within PeopleSoft to track at a job code level what the essential duties are, the working conditions, qualifications, experiences, all of those things. And this was an enhancement that was made with this recent implementation as well, where it's really locked down. So at a job code level, you kind of have to have these things as part of your job posting, and it's controlled by the administrative office, but forms can be submitted to improve or make changes to that. And then these bottom two sections are all the person needs to fill out. So they can say if they're supervisor duties, and then the bottom section is for any department specific things that they want to show up in their Taleo posting once that gets approved. Then the next page we come to will indicate what this FTE and standard hours are that they want for these new positions and the proposed salary for those new positions. The bottom half that we're seeing here is the funding. So that's really where that pre-authorization for them is important because someone has to say, how are you going to pay for this person if you do hire them, if we allow you to put it on Taleo and recruit. And so this isn't going out necessarily right now and changing funding because someone could be in an existing position and you don't want to change it until you're moving the new person into the position. But you can search by combo code here. And you can also search by the account, the fund, org, all of those attributes that you see in a normal PeopleSoft screen when you're doing funding and picking the combo code. So we'll just pick the combo code here. But you can add additional rows. So you can split it 50-50 to say, well, I'm getting half of my funding from this location and I plan to get half my funding here, or you could split it. I think maybe we limited it to like 4 or 5 rows here. I was going to say up to 10, but I don't think we got quite that crazy. And then there's some additional questions that they have to answer. Is this going to increase the department's headcount? Is it grant funded? And then they have to provide some extra explanation so that as this is approved, they can justify or know where these costs are coming from. And then based on the setup and those selections that the user made throughout the form, various documents will be required based on what they've requested to have approved. So in this case, the person filling out this particular form has to upload 2 items, the justification and the org chart before they proceed. And so we have just blank documents that we upload in place of these, but in the real world, they'll actually have to upload, and those would be the documents that would be reviewed as part of the request as well. And then once that's done, the user can submit the form. And then that starts that first level of workflow approvals. This is the most intense approval process for this particular one. Or this form, the pre-authorization and then the hire, because once they've entered stuff onto this form, we then lock it down in future steps. So not as many people have to approve because they know that it will follow what was approved here. So you can see all the various workflow steps in here that it goes through. And as Marcy mentioned, a user can come back in at any point in time and see where their form is at in the approval process. So once that's completely approved, what happens is it goes out, and if it's a hire they were requesting to post, then it's out on Taleo. People can apply to that job. And once they identify an applicant, then they can come in here. So the first one I'm showing here is that if I know the person I want to hire and I know they're an internal person, maybe they're I posted the job and I hired internally, so I'm transferring them. I have that option to just come to Harry Potter and say, yep, I need to move Harry Potter into this position. I go and find my first pre-authorization form, search for it, pull them in. The second option is if you think it's a brand new person, and I say think because, with 3 campuses, it's very likely that maybe the Health Sciences Center doesn't know that the person they hired is an employee, even though they should probably tell you. And so they can just go, hey, I want to hire a new staff member. And when they click on that, they pull up that pre-authorization form that gave them the approval to post the job in the first place. And then the first thing that shows up is really kind of a search match to say, okay, give us the person you hired, give us their personal details. And at this point, we're doing another check just to make sure. So when we move to the next page, you'll see it gives us feedback to say, yep, this is a brand new social security number. You're right. This person doesn't exist in the system. When we complete this form, we'll create an Int'l ID for them. Alternatively, you might see something that says, this person already exists, so we picked the Int'l ID and put it on the form, and this is really a transfer. And so that people can be aware as they're hiring right away, oh, this person forgot to tell me that they already worked for OU in some capacity. As soon as we get that information in here, let's see, my holy button isn't working. Then we come through and fill in the form. So you can see the data we completed on the prior page populated into here. We fill in all of the personal data details about the person that we've collected, their marital status, citizenship. There's military information here as well that can be filled in, and ethnicity as we go down. And this all creates and gets updated into PeopleSoft as the form is processed. So I'll enter their address here. And then they can either say that the mailing address is the same as home, or they can enter a new one as well. They can enter phone information for the person. And then at this point, they can save that personal data and create the Int'l ID if they want. And then we move on to entering the job data. So this is where it's pulling some information from that first pre-authorization form and it's populating it into here, and it's locked down. So you can see up at the top here, the position number is locked down because we said what position number it was when we got the funding. So people can't change it. They can't really make a mistake at that level. But there are some things that maybe could vary from the pre-approval, like the reports to, that's fine. Like we don't really care if people change that, or whether their time, if they're a punch time or a web clock or something like that, really varies once you hire the person and you work out those details. So they can make updates to some of that information. They can say where the person will work and then where they live while they're working there, and if they're telecommuting, and give some extra information about what needs to be done if there is any telecommuting. Here's where we can see that the proposed annual salary per position that we created. So we created 2, which means that we're just hiring one of those 2. We can hire a second, which would give us the second position number. But it was $40,000 at a 1.0 and a 40 FTE. So people can choose to have less, but they can't go over that. So if I come in and I enter my hourly rate, and it indicates that the total compensation here would be more than $40,000, it stops me and says, yeah, there's a problem. You didn't get approved for that much money. So you have to then go back in and either decrease the amount, or they would need to go get another pre-authorization if they needed that amount of money more. They can add in some multiple components of pay here that total the salary at the bottom. We then go in and say the training that will be required for this person as they move into their new position, which can trigger those automated processes that assign trainings to people and ensure that they're completing them. So this is all just kind of going down, and OU specifically wanted to make people fill in every box so they wouldn't kind of autopilot click check all to yes or check all to no. And I think people maybe don't like not being on autopilot. And then the final page here is where if there needs to be Regents approval, their users know when Regents approval is required, so they can toggle that to yes, so it would route. They can upload any optional file attachments at this point as well, and then they can submit the form. So all of those forms that were all separate and individual, kind of 4 or 5 different processes floating around with all of their own workflow, they were also having to repopulate the form every single time they submitted it. And now at this point, it kind of just pulls it all through and makes it very quick for the end user, trying to minimize the number of clicks it takes or the things that they need to look up in the system and could potentially get wrong. So just to talk a little bit about the project methodology that went into not only this form, I don't know if you guys can see that box. Let me close that. Okay, so not only this form did we work through this, but as Marcy listed off as part of their new merged go live approach, there was really a number of forms that we use this methodology for, and we use the same really across any of our projects that we're doing for Gideon Taylor as well. So we have our main key areas that we go through. So the first thing is in discovery, we really went through and we examined all of the current processes that they have today, not just ones that they already had forms for or had already automated, but what are those extra things that are feeding into the form, or where are people getting this data from if it's not in PeopleSoft? Where is it stored? Are there spreadsheets that people are tracking that we need to replace? Mapping all of the dependencies between all of those things as well. And then we had a lot of discussions about what was working well because they had forms already and had used them for 10 plus years. They had things that they knew they wanted to keep and they didn't want to change those things. So we didn't want to break it. But there, of course, were things that weren't working well. So some of those were just the number of approvals people had to do, or the repetitive, I've told you this once already. Why do I have to keep telling you in every single form type of things? And then one key thing that we always warn people going into discovery is be prepared to be uncomfortable. I think we always get people eventually at some point in discovery that's like, oh, why do you want to change this? Like, why are we even talking about it? This is terrible. Just leave it as is, but that's really the role of discovery, is to say, like, don't stay in your comfort zone, but let's get uncomfortable. Let's dream the world, and how this could maybe come together in a completely different way before we land on a solution, because that's usually where we find the most innovative and the biggest return on our investments are in those key places. We did a lot of prototypes, just building quick forms in the framework. So we could say, oh, the fields are here. Oh, how does that look? And getting feedback. And then we made a high level plan, say, okay, what are we building? What's the flow of all of these things that we could always come back to and say, okay, like, was that part of the goal of this project or not? And then once we get through discovery, that's where we say, okay, now we're going to go. We're going to start building. And we like to kind of be flexible in building, so we don't want to spend too much time up front in the big waterfall approach, of creating this big giant design document. But we also live in a world where people need to know how much it's going to cost or how much time it's going to take to get to the end. So we have to define it in a little bit more kind of chunks of time, if you will. So we like to tackle it in 3 different passes. So our very first pass, we really just focus on what are the fields that are needed on the page, what are the pages that we need, and what PeopleSoft updates need to happen. And then we design that, we develop it, we model it to the key users, and we get feedback. So they can say, ooh, I just realized we forgot that one field, or we need to come back and see this order isn't right. We have defaulting going in the wrong order, and I really want to tell you union code before I pick position or something, those types of things. But it's a lot easier to see on the screen when you're looking at a real form versus continuing to work off of these design documents. Our second pass is where we focus on the brains and the logic of the form. So we don't ever like to show a field if the user doesn't have to populate it. It's confusing to users. And so we do a lot of conditional hiding and showing. So based on what you're picking, how do we know when we need that from the person or not? What questions can we ask them? What information can we populate in from PeopleSoft? What error messages do we need on the form? All of those kinds of things. And then we cycle through that same, design it, we develop that next pass, we model it, we gain more feedback. At that point, we might find a field we missed or something. So we get all of that feedback, and then we finalize up to that point before we go into the third pass, which would be our workflow, our notifications, our navigation, and our security kind of rounded up. So where does the form need to route at each step? How will people get to the form? Those related actions. What's the security? Who can perform that related action? who shouldn't be able to see it. And again, we do the same thing. We spend some design time on that specific item, we develop it, we model it, and we finalize it. And we find that we're really successful in breaking it up in those 3 passes because it makes things more manageable. If you try to tackle it all at once, it can be very overwhelming, not only for the people trying to design it, but also for the people you're trying to get to approve the design or give you information. So if you really zero in and focus, it kind of just helps give each key area their time to shine, and not have things missed. And then, of course, at that point, then we migrate the solution. We do a big solution test after that to make sure it migrated okay and everything is still working as intended. And then we turned it over to the OU team to really jump in and do a lot of UAT. And since they went from 2 merged systems, we were using a brand new PeopleSoft system. It really took a lot of coordination, and they were trying to just learn, this new world of their new combined PeopleSoft system, as well as the new forms. So we went through several revisions and rounds in UAT, where we also made some design changes after we learned what the new system would look like. And then, of course, the big go live. We had a lot of announcements. Marcy and her team did a really good job of just communicating to campus, so they knew what was coming. They knew the changes that would happen. And including some pilot groups of users who could kind of give feedback, but also making sure that training was available to people. Marcy, do you have anything that you want to add or say about your go live or training or anything like that?
Yeah, we at the same time this project was underway, our financials PeopleSoft was also consolidating and going live. And they went live 6 months before we did, and we learned a lot from their go live experience. It didn't go great. There was a lot of concerns about how the training was or was not useful. And you can imagine just people learning a new system, they're just grumpy anyway. But we got a lot of feedback. And so we worked really hard to provide clear job aids, and we did video training of the forms, and this project was on a very short timeline for something with this sort of ambition. The whole project was, not just the forms part. And so we hired out some of the training, building the training here as well. So we had Gideon Taylor help us with that. So they were really our partners through and through the whole thing. And we ended up with a kind of filmed training, like the demos we just showed with job aids that went with it. And we've continued to build on that now, things that we're creating and changes we make. So we had started at a good place and went forward. We also, the change management plan also included bi-weekly meetings with all of our heavy users. So we had a big meeting. Some of them had 100 people in them, and they were the department users, the ones that do these transactions. And we would tell them what's new. We'd highlight new features. We'd tell them what we were still developing and reveal to them. And then we'd hear from them, like what was broken, like that training page. They all really hated clicking every single box. So we put that on the list to allow them to select no to all the training, right? And so we are about to put that live now out into the wild. We weren't able to do it to start with, but we gathered their feedback and then told them what we did with their feedback and what we could roll out. So it was a real kind of interactive process with our population. It was an intense amount of work though, so I don't want to downplay the amount of time it takes to do change management even halfway well. But I think people overall, while it's different than the old system, they do feel like they were prepared to do the work. And we very quickly had them all in the system because we were processing a payroll 2 days after we went live. So everybody got paid. So the process worked.
That's always the good thing, the goal, right? As long as everyone gets paid. Awesome. Thanks, Marcy. I think we have just one more video we wanted to show just to give you guys another idea and see some things that the OU team implemented. So this one is the add pay form. So it integrates with PeopleSoft's additional pay component. They do have many ways that they can submit some of these forms and some of the data that's included here. But this is just a cool form to show because they have some other complexities that we hit. So we have the same thing. They can search. We're going to search for Gideon Taylor here. We pull up our friend Gideon Taylor. We see all the actions that I can take as the user that I'm logged in. So I pick add an additional pay form. When this loads, I can go ahead and see Gideon Taylor's job history in here. So if there's anything that I just want to verify from job data, I can go ahead and view that and see it. The form's also pre-populated with information in here. So as I change information on the form, it will highlight it in yellow. I can scroll back to see the current values if I need, and that shows up throughout the approval process so people can see exactly what was changed or requested for part of the form. For this one, the pay period is really limited. So they had some key logic that determines what pay periods a person can select in order to do the add pay, how far back or how far forward you can go. And it has to be a pay period end date that they select for their own business processes. So instead of having just a calendar, they get a list that just says, okay, here's the only 3 options that you have, pick which one you want. And then the department, for this particular person, we're seeing this message here that says this person doesn't have access to a department. So as a user, I've come in and I've said, okay, I want to pay someone outside of my department security because they're doing something for me. But because I'm doing that, I can't pay from their home department. I don't have the access to do that. So this message is telling me you have to pick what department you want to pay from. And then the list that I get is only the departments that I have access to based on my row level permissions within the system. So it really forces them to pick a valid department that they have authorization for, but it also doesn't lock them out so much that they have to go and find the home department and say, hey, can you process this add pay for me? Because I don't have access to do that. And so then they'll pick what the earn code is. The earn codes that are available are based on setup tables and configuration based on those employee groups. And so that it's really limited down to this employee, what type of payments can be made. They put in the number of paychecks and the amount per paycheck, which then calculates that total payment out for them so that they can see it. They pick the begin date and the end date for when the work will be completed. A justification is required for them to type into here. They do have the ability on this form to also update titles, which is something that is a little bit custom in some cases for OU. But if they're doing an add pay, in some cases, it's mapped to an additional title that someone has. So this page that I'm opening up here is just showing based on the funding. So the last one we saw was, hey, I don't really have access to this person's position. And so in that case back here, we can see that the funding is just showing as blank. So how are you going to fund this payment? What's the combo code that will be used? And I don't have an option to just use their position funding because I don't have access to their position. So in this case, the user would be required to total to 100% and they'd have to enter in the funding on the form. And they can use multiple rows if they need. But this one that I'm transitioning to here is what it looks like if as a user, I have access to that position and that department. Then I can just see the position level funding here. And I can just choose to use some or all of that to easily copy it down. So I can say, you know, copy all the position funding down, or here I can pick just a specific row and it will move it down to the funding. So it makes it a little bit easier for users if they just want to say, yep, use the position funding, that's great. Or if they need to make some little tweaks or changes, or if they need to just completely use different funding for this, it really makes it easy for them. And there is also that additional routing needed down at the bottom that we'll see on this form as well. Once we get it to a total of 100, so it'll error out if we try to submit it at 110, so people can really see, okay, I finalized it, and it shows the amount. So if you can either pick the amount that you're paying on that account, or you can pick the percent, and it will calculate back and forth so the users can keep an eye on that and make sure that it's accurate. They can attach files if they need. In some cases, we might have certain attachments required based on the earn code. And then it will submit and start its workflow routing. And it will eventually update the add pay component once all the approvals happen. One other complexity for this add pay form is they also have a need where they process massive amounts of add pays, maybe every single pay period, and they need to add new ones or they might change. And so there's a feature for this particular form where departments have access. They can list it all out on a spreadsheet so they don't have to keep entering it form by form. They then upload the spreadsheet into a tool within PeopleSoft, which creates a form for every single row on that spreadsheet with its own routing. They can put all of the funding details in it and everything like that. And based on the department, the funding, it has its own rules for where it needs to route. And then as it's routing, there are some people who also have to approve a crazy number of add pay forms within the system as well. So instead of having to go in and open up every single form, they have this action center tool where they can see information at a high level. Here's Harry Potter's add pay. They can see the amount of it. They can see the accounts that are being paid on. And so they can select multiple rows and approve all of those rows at once, or say, I want to approve and I want to submit all, approve all of these forms in my queue at once. So it really makes it easier than having to kind of click in every single form from when they have a lot of those bulk features. And Marcy, did I miss anything on the add pay that you want to go back and talk about?
No, I think the major highlight, other than all the logic that is in it, is that it is one page. It's like our shortest form, and so it people can get through it pretty quickly, and they just like how streamlined that one is. The kind of shifting a little bit, we wanted to talk about this project itself and how we were able to do it. So we had from October of 2019 to January 1st of 2021 to consolidate PeopleSoft and rebuild and build new all of our forms. It was a very aggressive timeline, and there were a few things that made it possible. And most of that came from our strong executive support and our governance structure. So we had an executive committee, an executive sponsors committee, and a steering committee. And then we had the project team. The project had about 60 people in it, and we met multiple times every week. We were meeting all the time, but as a big team, we were meeting at least once a week. And then the steering committee met and the executive sponsors meeting met. And what that allowed us to do is the certain kinds of decisions we could make at the project team level, and then they were escalated up that governance structure as needed. What we got from the executive sponsors handed down to us are kind of guiding principles and the mandate for the project. And so that it was mandated that the timeline was a certain length and had a certain scope, like we were bringing the systems together. And so really the only movable factor was how much money we could spend on it and how many people we could get into it to help us. So we had a lot of support thrown behind the project. So we had consultants on board from both Gideon Taylor and Huron. And we had these principles that helped us make decisions. So we were told and lived by, we use delivered components, and we reduced the number of customizations at every turn, and the number of integrations and interfaces. However much we could reduce, we were told to do that. And we did that through a process of inventorying all of our current systems and all of our processes. And then Huron and Gideon Taylor helped us redesign those processes and implement them. So we ended up really relying on, like, there were so many times when people were asking me, well, we really wanted to do this because it used to do that. And I said, well, is that delivered? No, it's not. Okay, well, what can we do with what's delivered? And that mandate really came from that 20 years full of customizations kept us from staying up to date on on PeopleSoft releases, and we just were getting tax updates in by the end. So we didn't get to use any of the new delivered items. And so being able to have those mandates about how the system was going to be built, and then a real strong commitment to using eForms, allowed us to kind of use PeopleSoft as much as delivered as possible. And we had a very strong commitment from our team, our sponsors, to do that. And, if we did the project all over again, we might make a few different choices, but we ended up having to make, because of the limited timeline, a lot of things we rebuilt the way they were and have committed to phase 2 priorities, which we're actually doing. I know phase 2 is where ideas go to die usually, but we're actually doing them. And there's just been a continued momentum to continue to build out the system, because we just couldn't get everything we wanted into the project timeline. So we still have project meetings, and the project is put to bed, but we still have meetings with all of the developers and functional teams that are working on these things. Right now we're in open enrollment. That's our first open enrollment in the new system. IT is, on speed dial to help us with this, that, or the other. We had a ton of turnover internally during this time. And so some of our people are learning open enrollment setup for the first time. And so we're really relying on the couple of people that have long time internal experience to help our kind of new people come on. We also shifted the whole project to be remote because of the pandemic, and it worked out. It worked out well. So we limited travel. So our sponsors saw that as savings, and we also were able to reallocate some of that travel budget to project functionality. And so we just lived on Zoom. I still live on Zoom. I don't know about you guys, but we spent a lot of time together on Zoom. Like, we increased the amount we met because we weren't getting to meet in person. But overall, I think the project would be considered very successful. And we couldn't have done that without being able to rely on this whole team of people. And the success we've had integrating eForms into our PeopleSoft systems has resulted in some great numbers of a lot of activity we were able to do. So that's what the next slide will be. And then we're actually putting eForms into other PeopleSoft systems. And so we'll spend just a second looking at that too. So on the next slide, it's just showing what our first half of the year looked like. We did 40,000 forms in the first 6 months. We onboarded 1,400 new employees during that time. I've got 800 users that have some sort of role in the system. And we have a very limited central staff that supports the system. And we're working on improving that, but it has spread us very thin. But we're able to do it because we have good relationships with all of our departments, but also the system tends to work the way we expect it to. And that is a testament to how much thought we put into it from the beginning. So in PeopleSoft, in HR, these are the things that we've got kind of pending for us. We're dreaming about an onboarding process. At the beginning of that pre-authorization form, you saw putting in all that personal data. That would be really great if that was just there from the candidate. We don't have that right now. I was in a conversation not long ago with someone who started at OU in 1991, and basically our onboarding process is the same. And that was really painful to hear that person talk about it. I'm like, oh, it hasn't really gotten better. So that's on a wish list. Our campus solutions, that's the student product. They have several forms in there. And then there's a project in PeopleSoft Financials where they're managing grants. And that was in discovery last year, and it is going into development. I think, Lynette, you said next week, right? So we have an institution-wide commitment to using eForms. And one of the major reasons for that is that especially in the newer framework, we are able on the functional side to do so much more with it. And so we advocate for the institution's commitment to it because where it makes us more agile to respond to the needs of the university. Like that remote work plan, we really are in need of that. And as soon as we catch our breath, we'll be able to start kind of delivering things like that to campus. So it's great. I think our next slide is just kind of where we're going generally. So that's Lynette.
Yeah, so some of the trends we've seen, not only for the OU team, but just for our clients when it comes to eForms and what they're tackling, we're seeing more and more that these types of forms or automation are getting rolled out to a greater number of people. So when we started this, 20 years ago, automating business processes and improving upon things, it was often we were talking about department self-service and there was a main department admin. And so maybe people would come to that person and that's who was interacting with the system. But we're seeing more and more that people are used to technology because it's fluid and they can pick up their phone or their iPad while they're on the go instead of having to go and find a department admin and that being easier. They can really pull up the system and they can start the form. Even if we just say, hey, give us some basic information, and then that routes to a department admin, it helps build upon that automation so you don't have all of these shadow systems. Or we might see that there's just really, employee-specific forms or student-specific forms that are in there that don't really require any approval at all. But we're able to roll it out to more people within the organization so that they can have a good front end user experience and it's easy to manage. One thing that I think just we hear about this more and more is external participants. So we're seeing where on the grant side for OU, the project that's starting, there's a lot of people who participate in the whole grant management process who don't have access to the university's PeopleSoft system. Or we see for one of our clients, they're actually having people come in who just live in the county and they're filling out a form. So they're not an employee. They have no other reason to be in the system, but they may need to collect information from them so that they can click on that. Or another university is, as part of their hiring process, they gather references and then they start reference eForms, which actually go out to whoever that reference is and collects it in a form and makes it part of that main partner form. So we're really seeing a big jump in those external participant forms as well, and getting people into the system by using a unique token, and they don't have to have access to PeopleSoft in order to use it, but we can still use the power of PeopleSoft and the smarts and the brains and pulling in information for the people who have access and the administrators as they're trying to approve or work the forms. We're really seeing, and the first form that Marcy talked to this is that we're not just talking about forms, individual forms anymore. We're talking about managing whole processes. So before, Marcy and the OU team had the pre-authorization form was really the freeze form and the job description form and the hire form and the job change form, and they were all these separate forms. But more and more the trend is, hey, let's look at this start to finish, and let's not think of it in terms of what department needs that form, but let's think of it from the end user's perspective. What are all the steps that they need to take, and how can we make that flow for them and be really seamless with the least number of clicks, providing the least amount of information. Quick creation forms, though I wouldn't count any of OU's forms as a quick creation form. In some ways, what Marcy said, it is, because they knew we can't get this 100% perfect right now. We're not going to get every single feature that we want right now. So instead, let's go live with what we know we need, and let's plan in a phase 2. So we actually let our users interact with the form and we learn from them what is really important, not what we are trying to predict will be important to them maybe in the future, because oftentimes those guesses cause us to invest in the wrong places. So even if you do a quick form go live with a more complex form, that's a really great way to do it. Don't try to solve every problem at once. Get it out there and let people use it, and then get their feedback. Let them tell you what would make it better. Or we're really seeing often with self-service forms or work from home forms or things like that, create a form in a day and roll it out and don't worry too much about the details there. Focusing on redefining the user experience. So the whole process of picking what form you're launching into, first seeing the person, and then getting a related action that only gives you the valid choices that you can pick for that person. So it kind of helps to flow things differently than what we were used to. And of course, eForms in the cloud. You can't have any session out there without talking about the cloud, but just people in general moving to cloud platforms to try to improve performance of the system and things like that. And I think we finished with just a few minutes left. So we can go ahead and open it up to questions. If you guys want to take a look at anything else or ask any questions of either Marcy or I. Let's see. Okay, so Jonathan said, you may have mentioned this, but how many forms do you have in total in HR, Marcy?
Can you go to slide 7, Lynette?
Yes, I think I can. Just close your eyes because it's going to be a little, okay.
So this is what we have live right now. So I'm going to say 10.
I'm just trying to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Yeah, and the pre-authorization has 2, so.
Oh, 11.
Yeah, so so that's how many we've got right now, and we have some kind of queued up, but we kind of got given another big project that's taken up a lot of our time, so we haven't launched a lot of the new forms we expected. Lay asked about how this compares to workflow, what's delivered in manager self-service. And to be honest, I don't have a good perspective on that because of our timeline. We went with what we knew as an institution. And none of our developers knew manager self-service, and none of our functional users did. So we made that as a strategic decision. I bet there's a conversation.
I could probably add some of that. I think it's worth knowing that on any one of their job data forms, they're not updating job data. This goes back to we're managing a process. We're not managing, here's a job change form and that's it. We're saying we have all of these other components. So I think their job change form it updates like 7 or 8 PeopleSoft components, and job data is only one of those. So when you're looking at the job data modernization, it's awesome for system users where you want to hide and show fields on job data, but they're feeding into Taleo, time and labor, their training component. So they really have kind of the start to end process. They also use position funding at the department level. So that's probably a really big difference. And that goes to when you say the MSS workflow, I assume you mean the guided self-service. So their form also for basic transactions, it can be awesome and it can meet the need, but it doesn't have all these extra fields that build upon that whole process of creating, what's the job code level details of the KSAs that we need to then post on the applicant tracking system. So that would be where they kind of gather more from there. So I think we have some more questions here. Let's see.
Yeah, so Pravin, they can reinitiate, they can both fix a form and resubmit it, or it can be denied and they start it all over again. Either way. So in the workflow, it can be sent back to the beginning. And then Jonathan asked about development and customizations. So the eForms don't require us to have customizations there, right? Like we have some in the PeopleSoft, but we didn't have to make them to deploy the eForms. The development, so our IT development staff is involved in building eForms, but it's probably about a 70% functional configuration, and there's a certain amount that IT developers have to do to move. They migrate forms. They do some of the people code programming that we use for logic, but there's a ton of the work that we can now do in the forms from the functional side.
And so I think
I'll insert there.
Someone Okay, and someone had asked who to contact if you're interested. So Marcy's contact information is here. This is mine. Scott is also a really good contact if you want to have more conversations about GT forms, costs, and get a demo or
The one
things.
last question there from Joanne. We have an integration to financials that brings in the approved budgeted financial codes, all the chart field spreads into our budget tables. And so that is what's available for them to pick from. It helps a lot.
And with that, sorry, I'm so sorry, but we are out of time.
Thank you guys very much.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Feel free to reach out if you have questions. Have a good day.